Meredith Abbey in October was a house that expected to be admired. It rose from the Shropshire countryside with the particular confidence of a building that had stood for 3 centuries and intended to stand for 3 more. Grey stone and tall windows, the remains of a medieval cloister converted into a formal garden, 2 wings added in the previous century by a duke with more money than restraint. The avenue of beeches leading to the main gate had turned, and in the pale morning light they burned amber and copper against a sky the colour of pewter. The first carriages arrived on a Tuesday. Harriet Mallory arrived in the third, which was not her carriage. It belonged to Lady Forsyth, an acquaintance of Margot Calloway's from Bath, who had offered Harriet the spare seat when she learned they were both bound for Meredith. Harriet had accepted with gratitude and spent the journey reading, which Lady Forsyth found eccentric and said so twice. "You'll strain your eyes on these roads," Lady Forsyth said as the carriage lurched over a rut. "I have been straining my eyes on roads since I was 9, Harriet said pleasantly. "They have not failed me yet." Lady Forsyth's expression suggested she filed this information somewhere unflattering. Harriet did not mind. She was 26, which was old enough to have stopped apologizing for it. She had brown hair she wore simply because complicated arrangements required a maid she couldn't afford, and grey eyes that people occasionally described as striking when they were trying to be kind and unsettling when they weren't. She owned 3 good dresses and £40 a year from a trust her mother had protected from her father's creditors, supplemented by what she earned translating French academic texts. Not a fortune, but 3 years of careful accumulation that kept her in coal and books and the smallest decent rooms in Bloomsbury. She had Margot, which was worth more than any of it. Margot Calloway, the Duke of Meredith's younger sister, 4 years Harriet's junior, had written in September with the kind of letter that didn't leave room for refusal. "You must come," she had written. "Meredith in autumn is the only argument I know against living in town, and I want you there. Don't tell me you have obligations. I know what your obligations are, and they can wait 3 weeks." She had not mentioned her brother. Harriet had noticed the omission and thought nothing of it at the time. She noticed it now as the carriage turned through the Abbey gates, because it was the kind of omission that, in retrospect, had a shape. Meredith Abbey was not simply large. It was the kind of house that made a statement about the people who lived in it, and the statement it made was permanence. The stone was old and dark and certain. A groom came to meet the carriages before they had fully stopped, and 2 footmen appeared at the main doors with the coordinated efficiency of people who had been doing this for years. Harriet stepped down and looked at the house for a moment. Then Margot appeared at the top of the steps, and whatever complicated feeling the house had produced dissolved immediately into something warmer. "So you came," Margot said, which was not quite a greeting but was somehow better. "You didn't give me a reasonable alternative," Harriet said. Margot laughed and took her arm and drew her inside, and for a quarter of an hour Harriet forgot entirely about the Duke of Meredith. She was reminded of him at dinner. Not because he was there, he was not, having sent word that he would arrive the following afternoon, but because he was discussed, which at Meredith amounted to the same thing. The house ran on his authority even in his absence. The guests spoke of him with the particular mixture of deference and appetite that attached itself to dukes in general and to unmarried ones specifically. "Miss Mallory." Mrs. Fielding turned to her with the bright attention of a woman who had exhausted the more promising conversational avenues. "You are a particular friend of Lady Margot's, I understand." "We met when I was companion to her aunt some years ago, Lady Westing." "Ah," a small recalibration occurred behind Mrs. Fielding's eyes. "And you are not currently in that position?" "No. Lady Westing died 3 years ago and left me a very good library and the freedom to be disagreeable without professional consequence." The silence. Then Mr. Fielding laughed, genuinely, and Margot refilled Harriet's wine without being asked. After dinner, when the ladies had retired, Margot sat beside Harriet and said very quietly, "He's not what you expect." "I expect nothing," Harriet said. "I barely remembered he existed until an hour ago." "He's been not himself lately, since the Ashworth business." Harriet said nothing. She knew in the general way that anyone who moved in even peripheral relation to society knew that the Duke of Meredith had been engaged 2 years ago to a Miss Ashworth of considerable fortune, and that the engagement had ended, abruptly, publicly, with enough witnesses to ensure it was discussed for months afterward. "I'm sorry for him," she said, and meant it. "Public humiliation is its own particular cruelty." He rebuilt himself around not caring. You can imagine how convincing it is. Harriet could. She recognized the specific quality of a person who had been hurt in front of an audience and decided afterward that the safest thing was to become the kind of person who couldn't be hurt at all. He'll marry someone appropriate eventually, and it will all be forgotten. That, said Margot, is exactly what he says. Piers Calloway, 5th Duke of Meredith, arrived the following afternoon at 3:30. He was 34. He was not a man who entered a room. He arrived in it, which was a different thing. Tall, dark-coated, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome in a softer way when he was younger, and had since become something more severe and more interesting. He greeted Margot last, which was a habit, saving the one thing he actually wanted for the end. "You look tired," Margot said, which meant "I've missed you" in their particular language. "I'm perfectly well," he said, which meant "I know." She took his arm and said in the same tone she might use for "the library has been repapered," "I've invited someone I think you should meet." "Margot. Her name is Harriet Mallory. She is the sharpest person I know, and she makes me laugh until I can't breathe, and you are going to be awful to each other, and I am very much looking forward to it." He stopped walking. "What does that mean?" "It means she doesn't perform," Margot said serenely. "You'll see." She was right as it happened. He saw. The introduction did not occur as planned. It was meant to happen before dinner on the second evening. But Harriet had, on 2 separate occasions that afternoon, positioned herself at a distance from the moment when Margot appeared to be steering the Duke in her direction, and on both occasions had found a reason to be elsewhere, not rudely, not visibly, simply not there. She was not ready. That was what she told herself. It reached him, of course. These things always did in houses like this. By the time the guests gathered for dinner, Piers Calloway knew that the woman Margot had specifically wanted him to meet had twice avoided the meeting. He sat at the head of his table and looked down its length and found her. Brown hair, grey dress, speaking with quiet animation to old Colonel Marsh, apparently entirely unconcerned. He was not accustomed to being avoided. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself it was mildly amusing. Then, between the fish course and the remove, he heard her laugh. A real one, not performed. And something in his chest did a thing he chose not to examine. Later, Margot appeared at his elbow. "She's not avoiding you because she dislikes you." "I wasn't aware she was avoiding me," he said. "Of course not." Margot looked across the room to where Harriet was examining the shelves, running one finger along the spines with the careful attention of someone in a bookshop. "She has her reasons. Don't take it as an insult." He looked across the room again. Harriet pulled a book from the shelf, opened it, read a page, put it back, found another. This one she kept. He didn't ask which one. He thought about asking. He went to speak with Mr. Fielding about the pheasant shooting instead, and did not look at the bookshelves again, and was approximately 40% successful. The introduction finally happened on Thursday morning. It was raining. A cold, persistent Shropshire rain that had begun before dawn. Harriet was in the library at the far window with Gibbon, volume 3, which she had been meaning to read for 2 years, when the door opened, and the person who entered came directly to where she was sitting. She looked up. Piers Calloway, Duke of Meredith, stood 4 feet away with the expression of a man who had decided something and was executing it. "Miss Mallory, I find I must introduce myself, as the conventional method appears to have encountered some difficulty." Harriet closed Gibbon. She kept her finger on the page and looked at him with the calm attention she brought to most things. He was taller than she had registered from across dinner tables. His face in the grey morning light was composed, watchful, with the particular quality of someone who had learned to watch while appearing merely to look. She felt the familiar weight of it. Title, estate, expectation. She felt it and set it aside and said, "Your Grace, is it your general practice to decline introductions, or was there something specific to this occasion?" "I wasn't declining. I was postponing." She said it without apology. An introduction at dinner means someone is watching to see how it goes. An introduction in a corridor means everyone will hear about it by tea. I preferred to wait until a moment that was simply a moment. He was quiet for a count of 3. "And is this a satisfactory moment?" "It's a library in the rain," she said. "It's the best kind." Something crossed his face, not softening exactly, but an adjustment, as if he had expected one thing and received another, and was deciding what to do with the discrepancy. "Piers Calloway," he said, "Duke of Meredith, owner of an immodest number of books, most of which I have not read. Harriet Mallory, no title, no estate, reader of an immodest number of books, most of which I have. She looked at the gibbon. I hope you don't mind. Which volume? 3. I stopped at 2, he said. It becomes rather relentless. It does, but it improves. He said, I'll leave you to it, and went to the shelves on the opposite wall, pulled down a volume and sat in the other window seat. He stayed for an hour. They did not speak again. But the silence between them was, from the first minute, a different kind of silence than the room had held before he came in. That evening, before dinner, Harriet heard it. She was in the corridor outside the drawing-room. The door was ajar, and she heard 2 men speaking with the ease of privacy, voices carrying in the way that voices did in these old stone houses when the speaker believed himself unheard. The Mallory woman, is it? Margot's blue stocking. That was Grantley, a neighbour who had joined them for dinner. Rather a lot of opinions for a woman with nothing to recommend her but opinions. Didn't she refuse to be presented to you? I introduced myself, said the Duke's voice, even and dry, in the library. She was reading Gibbon. Still, I'd sooner marry a mule than a woman who led with her opinions and had nothing else to offer. What does she expect to do? Find a husband here? With what? There was a pause in which Harriet, standing very still in the corridor with her hand near the doorframe, became aware that her jaw had tightened. I couldn't say what she expects, the Duke said in a tone that closed the subject with the authority of a man who owned the building they were standing in. Shall we go in? Harriet stepped back, straightened, waited, then went in. She had worn her second-best dress tonight, the blue one, which was older but better cut, and at her throat she had pinned a small brooch, seed pearls set in silver, left to her by her mother. She wore it rarely. It had come out tonight without her having decided it should, the way certain things did when one needed quietly to feel like oneself. She did not think about the Duke's deflection on her behalf. She told herself it was simple courtesy, a host declining to permit rudeness about a guest, nothing more particular than that. She was moderately convincing. Dinner was long, and when she looked up midway through Colonel Marsh's account of India, she found the Duke watching her from across the table with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. She held his gaze for 1 second, then she looked back at the Colonel. The pearl brooch caught the candlelight. She felt it slightly cool against her collarbone. The rain continued for 4 days. It meant, among other things, that Harriet and the Duke kept finding themselves in the same room. The library was warm and well stocked, and both of them had independently identified it as the most tolerable place to be. On the first rainy morning, he arrived and took his window seat without comment. She was reading. He was reviewing correspondence, his pen moving with the precise economy of a man who wrote letters for function rather than pleasure. They did not speak for 40 minutes. Then, "The Gibbon, you've nearly finished it." She hadn't thought he'd noticed. I read quickly. "What will you read next?" "I had seen you have the 2nd volume of Wollstonecraft's letters written during a short residence. I wondered if I might borrow it." His pen stopped. "Wollstonecraft," he said with no inflection at all. "Is that a problem?" "I am merely noting that it is not in the category of books I would have expected a guest to mention, without some awareness that it might be considered pointed." "Your Grace, I am a woman with £40 a year, no connections of consequence, and 3 weeks in a house with 3,000 books. I intend to be as pointed as I like." He looked at her then, the slight recalibration of a man revising an expectation mid-sentence. "The Wollstonecraft is on the 2nd shelf from the top on the east wall, 3rd bay from the window." "Thank you." She went to find it. She was aware, crossing the library, that he watched her go. She did not turn around. The Wollstonecraft was on the settee when she came down for breakfast on Friday. On the settee she had most often used, with a strip of paper marking a passage. The pencil mark was faint in the margin beside a paragraph about the cost of dependence. One becomes so accustomed to needing permission that one forgets to examine whether the permission was ever necessary. No note, no signature, just the mark. She was still sitting with it in her lap when the Duke came in, poured his coffee, and sat at the opposite end of the table with his correspondence, and did not look at her once. She did not mention the book. He did not mention the book. But when she left with the Wollstonecraft under her arm, she heard, almost certainly imagined, the sound of a breath released. The rain cleared on Saturday. Margot organised a walk to the old walled kitchen garden, and 7 guests went, Harriet among them. The Duke went too, which surprised her. The walled garden was at the back of the estate, through a gate in a high brick wall that had trapped the day's thin sunshine. Espaliered pear trees lined the south wall, late roses in one corner, the box hedges trim and dark. Harriet found herself walking with the Duke. This had not been arranged. The party simply spread through the garden gate in ones and twos, and the two of them arrived at the same moment. "You've been reading the Wollstonecraft," he said. "She's angrier than people remember. They think of her as a philosopher, and forget she was also furious. Is that a recommendation?" "I think clarity that comes from anger is worth more than clarity that comes from comfort. Comfortable people don't need to be precise." He was quiet for a few steps. "You think I'm comfortable?" "I think you've made yourself comfortable, which is different, more deliberate." She hadn't meant to say that precisely. She waited for his expression to close. It didn't. "That is either an insight or an impertinence." "I suspect it's both." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "And are you comfortable?" "No, I can't afford to be." He stopped walking. She had gone 2 steps further before she realized. She turned back. He was looking at her with the look of a person hearing something that matches an experience they have not spoken aloud. "I meant financially," she said, "as a practical matter." "I know what you meant." "Come," he said. "Margot is heading for the Rose Corner." They walked on. Harriet noticed for the first time that she had not once thought about who he was. At dinner that evening she was not wearing the pearl brooch. She had picked it up and then set it down. It had felt tonight like something she wanted to keep to herself. She heard partway through the fish course the Duke's voice beneath the general conversation. "Where did you find her?" Margot's response was too quiet to carry. Then, "She's not what I expected." And Margot audible, "She never is." Harriet looked at her plate. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about her father. The particular way that men with titles had moved through her family's life, taking, assuming, departing. Her grandfather had borrowed against land secured by a viscount who shook hands and then didn't answer letters. Her father had trusted a lord's son with money he couldn't afford to lose and lost it, and the lord's son had been very sorry, but there it was. She was not comparing the Duke of Merath to these men. She simply knew what it cost when you forgot to stay clear. She wore the brooch again the following morning at breakfast, as a small private reminder. On Sunday there was church in the village, in a Norman building that smelled of damp stone and centuries of effort. Afterward, in the churchyard, Harriet found herself near the Calloway family headstones. On a stone slightly apart from the others, Catherine Anne Calloway, 1769–1809. "Beloved." "My mother," said the Duke, appearing beside her. "I'm sorry. 7 years ago." He looked at the stone. "She would have liked you." "You don't know that." She liked people who read Wollstonecraft and who said precisely what they meant and then stood by it. He told her briefly, without sentiment. Her habit of reading aloud at dinner when the conversation failed. Her opinion that the eastern wing of Merath was architecturally indefensible, the way she had called him Piers, with a particular inflection he had not heard since. 3 sentences. Then he stopped. "Thank you," Harriet said. He nodded. They walked back to the others. "He has not told anyone that in a very long time," she thought. "I should be careful, I know." The week turned. New guests arrived. A Lord and Lady Thornbury with their son, a pleasant young man of 22, who immediately attached himself to Miss Fielding with the cheerful confidence of someone who had nothing to lose. This resolved Miss Fielding's situation with a speed that surprised everyone except possibly Miss Fielding herself, who received his attention with the relief of a woman who had been aiming at a duke and found that a gentleman who actually noticed her was more than sufficient. The drawing-room rearranged itself, and Harriet had somehow come to occupy a position she had not claimed and could not precisely name, not the Duke's guest, not intimate with the household, but known to the library as well as anyone, and the Duke, when he entered a room in which she was present, located her within the first 30 seconds. She noticed him noticing. She did not draw attention to the fact. On Tuesday evening the party played whist. The Duke played with the calm efficiency of someone for whom cards were not interesting, but winning was a default preference. He made no unnecessary moves. He revealed nothing. Harriet watched him. He kept his tells close. There was only one she found, small. When he held a strong hand, his left thumb moved slightly against the edge of the card. Not a visible movement, barely a movement at all. She did not use it. It felt obscurely like an intrusion. When the table broke up, The Duke poured wine and in doing so poured hers last, putting him briefly beside her. "You saw it," he said very quietly. "Saw what?" "You found something and then you didn't use it." "I don't know what you mean," she said. "Of course not." He moved away and Harriet looked at her wine and felt the back of her neck warm. Wednesday brought the cold. Harriet went out in the mornings before the household properly woke, a habit from home, where the only privacy available was the outdoors. She had not known anyone at Merath rose early enough to notice. She had been wrong. On Wednesday morning she came around the corner of the east wing and found the Duke on the stone terrace, standing with something hot, looking across the lawn to where the mist was still thick in the tree line. "Miss Mallory." "Your Grace." She stopped. "I'll walk on." "You don't have to." She came to stand at the other end of the terrace, far enough to be unremarkable. They stood in the cold for a while. "Most people," he said, "would use 8 degrees as an argument for remaining indoors. Most people have not spent 3 winters in a 4-room cottage with a leaking roof. This is extremely manageable. 4 rooms. My father was not practical with money. The cottage was what remained. My mother died when I was 12, my father 6 years ago. It is only me." She said it without self-pity, because self-pity was a luxury and accuracy was more dignified. The position with Aunt Westing was fortunate. She paid tolerably, and when she died she left me enough that I can live carefully and have a room of my own. I translate now. French texts primarily. One publisher in London takes them. It isn't glamorous. It is mine. He turned to look at her fully. "My God," he said not unkindly, "you have built yourself a life from nothing." "Most people do. They simply don't mention it in company." He was quiet a moment. Then, "I brokered my estate out of 3 years of debt my father left me. I have not told anyone that. My solicitors know, and Margot suspects, and that is all." Harriet understood what it was, an exchange. He had given her something because she had given him something. This was how it worked between people who were honest and had reason to be careful. "Then we are both," she said, quietly managing. "It appears so." The mist lifted from the trees. In the house something was beginning, the sound of the household waking. "I'll walk," Harriet said. "Yes." She went across the lawn. She did not look back. She didn't need to. Thursday was the neighborhood dinner, the dining room arranged at full length for 20 guests. Before dinner, a Miss Alderbridge of 19 cornered Harriet in the drawing room with the air of someone waiting to deploy something. "Miss Mallory, are you an old friend of the family?" "Of Lady Margot's." "How delightful. And your family?" "Miss Alderbridge," said the Duke's voice, appearing with the precision of someone who had been watching. "Have you met Colonel Marsh? He served in your father's regiment, I believe." Miss Alderbridge was redirected toward the Colonel before she had quite understood what had happened. The Duke did not look at Harriet. "Thank you," she said. "I have no idea what you're referring to," he said pleasantly, and moved to greet someone across the room. Harriet stood for a moment with her wine. She was not moved in a way that changed anything. She was noticed. Not her beauty or accomplishments, but the particular grain of her situation, the way a person stands on uncertain ground. He had seen it, and he had moved. She wore the pearl brooch. She had not decided to wear it. She had simply fastened it, and there it was. After dinner, Margot found her in a window seat. "You wore your brooch," she said. "I often wear it." "You wore it the first night, then not for 3 days now again." She tilted her head. "What happened in your family?" "With the Duke." "Not a duke," Harriet said. "A viscount, and a lord's son." She told her the shape of it, her grandfather's debt, her father's trust, the pattern of men with titles who had been so very convincing, and so very sorry afterward, and who had nonetheless gone on perfectly comfortably, while her family had not. Margot listened, then, "Piers is not those men." "I know he isn't. Knowing doesn't always move the feeling. He was betrayed too, rather publicly. He rebuilt himself into someone who couldn't be taken advantage of, and it cost him everything soft." She paused. "I invited you because I thought if there was anyone who could see past the armor without being frightened of it, it was you, because you have your own." "Margot, don't." "I am merely a woman sitting with her friend. I have no agenda whatsoever." "You have a very precise agenda." "I love you both very much," Margot said, "and I am going to refill my wine." She left. Harriet sat alone and looked across the room. The Duke was standing near the fireplace and, as if the moment had a hinge, he looked up and met her eyes. He held it for 2 seconds. She looked away first. Her heart was doing something she refused to name. On Friday morning she came to the terrace early. He was there. He looked at her and said nothing, just made room in the silence. Then, "Margot tells me nothing. She invited you and said you were the sharpest person she knew and then said nothing else. That's how she operates. Did she tell you about the engagement?" She looked at him steadily. "Only the shape of it, not the substance." She left, of her own decision, which was entirely her right, but she did it at Lord Brentwood's ball in front of 40 people, and I had not known it was coming. I was not graceful about it. You were surprised? Like the ground had gone? "Yes," he said. "I know what it is," she said, "to have the thing you depended on removed without warning. My father. He was not a practical man, but he was my father, and when he died, I discovered he had not been managing things for years. I was 20, and there was nothing." The mist shifted. A horse made a sound from the stables. "We are very different," he said, "and arrive at the same position." "Caution," she said. "Is that what you'd call it?" "I think sometimes it is simply cowardice dressed as judgment." "It might be both. Caution and cowardice look very similar from the inside." He looked up with the expression of a man who had said something true and was not certain what would be done with it. "Harriet," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it like a change in pressure. "Your Grace," she said, gentle, a boundary understood by both. They stood until the house began to wake, and then she walked and he stayed, and the morning held the shape of what hadn't been said as much as what had. It was Margot who found the letter, fallen from Harriet's writing desk when the maid tidied the room. The first line visible, "I write to inquire whether the volume of Racine translations might be considered." Margot put it back and went to find her brother in the estate office. "She's a translator," Margot said. "French texts. She has published under an initial." "I know," he said. "You know? She told me on the terrace Wednesday morning." Margot stared at him. He did not often share things. He had spent 2 years sharing almost nothing. The fact of it sitting in him unannounced was significant. She knew him well enough to know that. She said with deliberate lightness, "She's leaving Monday." He said nothing. "I thought you should know the timeline," she said, and stood. "Margot," she paused. "The brooch, the pearl one, she wears it sometimes and sometimes she doesn't. Do you know what it is?" "Her mother's. She wears it when she needs to feel like herself." He looked at his desk. "Right," he said. Saturday morning, Harriet came to the terrace and the Duke was not there. She believed approximately 60% of her claim not to have expected him. She walked, the kitchen garden wall, the lane, the field gate, and back. When she came through the garden gate, he was on the path coming toward her with the directness of a man who had been waiting, his coat thrown on with one button missed. "I owe you something," he said. "You don't." "I made a remark, before I had met you, to Grantley before dinner on Wednesday evening." She said nothing. She remembered the door. She remembered standing very still. "You may have heard it. The corridor carries sound poorly in this wing." A pause. "I heard Grantley," she said. "I did not hear your response." "My response was inadequate," he said. "The remark itself, I did not correct it at the time, and I should have. He said he would sooner marry a mule than a woman who led with her opinions." He held her gaze. "I did not say it, but I did not contradict it, and that is not the same as innocence." The garden was very quiet. "I see," Harriet said. "It was before I had spoken with you, before the library, before any of it. I had formed a picture from Margot's description and Grantley's tone and my own, cowardice, as I said, and the picture was wrong. It was unworthy, and I am sorry, Miss Mallory." She looked at him, in his half-buttoned coat on the garden path, saying something difficult without qualification. She understood this cost him something. "I was wrong, was not cheap even to an audience of one. People say things about women like me I have heard worse." "That doesn't make it—" "No, it doesn't. I appreciate the apology. I believe it. A beat. But when it was said, what were you actually afraid of?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "That Margot was right about you." "And are you still afraid of that?" "Yes," he said, "considerably more so than before." She kept her face still and professional. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said, and went past him toward the house. She was careful not to let her breath go until she had turned the corner. Sunday was her last full day. After luncheon, she went to the library to return the Wollstonecraft, east wall, second from top, third bay from the window. She climbed the rolling ladder and slid the book back. "You're leaving tomorrow," he said. She came down and turned. He was in the doorway. Of course, library's their room. Monday morning, 7 o'clock. He came in and stood near the central table with his hands behind his back, looking at her with the focused attention she had come to recognize as his version of vulnerability. "I would like to call on you when I am next in town." "Your Grace." "Piers, I would like you to use my name." Piers, the first time. "I am in lodgings in Bloomsbury. I translate Racine for £20 a text. I have 3 dresses and a pearl brooch and £40 a year. I am not—" "I know what you are. I have been paying attention. The world will say—" "The world said a great deal after the Ashworth business. I survived it. I find I care rather less about the world's assessments than I once did." She thought about her grandfather, her father, the careful list of reasons she had assembled over years. She thought about the annotated Wollstonecraft, the morning terrace, the churchyard, the half-buttoned coat on the garden path. "This is not the same thing. I know it isn't, and I am still afraid, and that is not a reason." "You may call," she said, "when you are next in town." He breathed, a controlled breath, but there. She crossed the library. He stepped aside. As she passed, they were close enough that— She passed. At the door she turned. "Don't keep me waiting long in town," she said. "I have a great deal of Racine to finish." She left him with what she was fairly certain, from the sound behind her, was the closest he had come to a genuine laugh in some time. She wore the pearl brooch to breakfast on Monday. She had packed it the evening before, and then at 6:30 in the dim light of her room, she had unpacked it and fastened it at her throat. It was her mother's. She wore it when she needed to feel like herself. Margot came down in a thick shawl over her nightclothes, her hair unbrushed, which moved Harriet more than she cared to show. "Write immediately," Margot said. "The moment you're in Bloomsbury." "I will." They embraced, brief, firm, sufficient. She was at the carriage step when she heard boots on gravel. Piers Calloway was crossing the drive in his coat and no hat, looking like a man who had heard a carriage being prepared and come out without thinking. "Safe journey." "Thank you." They looked at each other in the early morning light, grey and honest and insufficient. "The Racine, if it is published—" "I'll send you a copy," she said. She got into the carriage. The door closed, the horses moved. She did not look out the window. She sat straight, the pearl brooch cool at her throat. She touched it once, briefly, with 2 fingers. Then she opened Gibbon, Volume 4, which the Duke had placed on the breakfast table on Sunday morning, with a card that said simply, "Finish it." And she read, and the miles went under the wheels, and she let herself go. Bloomsbury in November smelled of coal smoke and wet stone. Harriet's lodgings on Montague Street were kept by a Mrs. Peel, who was 50, practical, and had a policy of not asking questions about her tenants' hours or occupations that Harriet had come to regard as one of the great mercies of her life. The rooms were on the first floor, a bedchamber, a small sitting room, and a closet she had converted into a study by the addition of a board across 2 crates. Mrs. Peel occupied the ground floor herself, and she received visitors there in the front parlour, when propriety required a witness, which it sometimes did. She worked, she translated. She sent the Racine to her publisher and received back cautious enthusiasm and a request for 2 more texts by February. She wrote to Margot twice. November moved. Piers did not come. She told herself she did not think about this, and was partially right. On the 14th of November, she rounded the corner of Montague Street, returning from the lending library, 2 volumes under her arm, and found a carriage outside Mrs. Peel's house that was, even to an untrained eye, extremely well appointed. She stopped on the pavement. The door opened. Piers Calloway stepped out, saw her, and went still. She had learned over 10 days at Meredith the vocabulary of his face, and what she saw now was a relief so controlled it was barely visible and completely unmistakable. "Miss Mallory," he said. "You're 3 weeks late," she said. "I'm aware I should have written." "Yes," she said. "You should have. May I come in?" "Mrs. Peel keeps the ground floor parlour for receiving visitors. Come in out of the rain." Mrs. Peel's parlour was small and brown, with a fire that burned adequately, and a settee that had seen better decades. Mrs. Peel herself appeared briefly, assessed the situation, offered tea with the efficiency of a woman who had seen many things and formed views on all of them, and withdrew to her adjacent kitchen with the door not quite closed, present enough to satisfy propriety, absent enough to allow conversation. Harriet sat on the settee. Piers sat across from her in the chair. She did not offer him the better chair because she was still, on some level, mildly irritated. 3 weeks, she said. I wrote. I sent the letter, and then there was a problem with a tenant family, a dispute about drainage that became a family matter, and by the time it was resolved, I was coming to London in any case. I thought a letter arriving days before me was insufficient. Show me the letter, she said. He produced it from his coat, folded, sealed, addressed in his hand. Miss H. Mallory, Montague Street, Bloomsbury, with the red wax seal of the Meredith dukedom. She took it, broke the seal, read it. 1 page. I find I am thinking about the library. I intend to be in London by the end of October, at which point I will call if the standing invitation holds. I hope the Racine proceeds well. I hope you are warm enough. P.C. She read it twice. I hope you are warm enough. She folded it and handed it back. The standing invitation holds, she said. The Racine proceeds extremely well. I have begun Corneille. Le Cid. My publisher thinks there is a market. There is, he said. I read it in French at Oxford. It's magnificent. You read Corneille. I was not always so relentlessly practical, he said, and it was dry enough to be funny, and she laughed, and the last of the irritation dissolved. They talked for an hour. She made tea on her spirit lamp upstairs and brought it down, which was a small domestic indignity she had long since made her peace with, and he accepted without comment, and asked questions about the Corneille with a specificity that told her he had read it carefully and remembered it. On the step leaving, he turned. There is an exhibition at the British Institution, Dutch paintings. Margot has been in London this week and recommended it. She suggested I might persuade you to attend. Margot is in town? For a fortnight. She would join us if that is. She thought you might enjoy it. Harriet looked at him. He met her gaze with complete composure, and she understood precisely that Margot had suggested nothing of the kind, and was probably not in London at all, and that this was his solution to the problem of propriety, offered with the straight face of a man who had once managed an estate out of debt through sheer force of careful management. Friday, she said. I will write to Margot. He nodded, a beat. You're wearing the brooch. I am. She touched it briefly. He looked at it a moment. Friday, he said, and went. She stood in Mrs. Peel's hallway with the folded letter still in her hand, longer than necessary. I hope you are warm enough. She was, she thought, increasingly. Margot was, as it happened, genuinely in London by Friday. She had come down for the winter weeks she spent every year visiting friends and attending the theatre, and she appeared at Mrs. Peel's door on Thursday evening with the expression of a woman who had received a letter and found it very entertaining indeed. He asked you to write to me, she said. He mentioned you had recommended the exhibition. He mentioned... Margot sat down on Mrs. Peel's parlour settee and looked at Harriet with bright, delighted eyes. He has never in his life required a chaperone. He has never in his life considered requiring one. The fact that he thought of it himself. Margot. I am merely noting, Margot said serenely, that a man who cares nothing for a woman does not arrange for her reputation to be protected. It would not occur to him. Harriet drank her tea. Will you come on Friday, she said. Wild horses, said Margot, could not keep me away. The British Institution on a Friday morning was pleasantly crowded, enough to be anonymous, few enough to move. He arrived at 11 exactly. Margot arrived at 5 past and promptly found an acquaintance across the room whose company she declared indispensable, which left Harriet and Piers to move through the galleries in the companionable way of people accustomed to their own company who didn't need to narrate what they saw. He stopped before a Dutch interior, a woman at a window, a letter in her hands, the light falling across her face with the particular quality of northern painting that made ordinary moments feel consecrated. The card on the wall attributed it to Gabriel Metsu, though the gallery had hedged with a question mark. What are you thinking? She asked. That she looks like someone who has received news. I can't determine whether it's good or bad. Harriet looked at the woman, standing very still. Both, she said. I think it's both. He looked at her. She looked at the painting. They moved on. In a smaller room, a social acquaintance caught Piers's arm and greeted him with the warmth of a woman very interested in the identity of his companion. He introduced Harriet without hesitation, not as Margot's friend, but as Miss Mallory, whose translations of Corneille I suspect will shortly be the subject of considerable discussion. Harriet looked at him. He met her gaze with absolute innocence. She filed this. Outside they walked along Pall Mall in the thin November sun, with Margot a tactful 20 paces behind, deep in apparently absorbing conversation with herself. "Mrs. Fairfax," he said, "her husband is in the Lords. She will have told 3 people by tea-time. And what will you say when asked?" He was quiet for half a block. "I will say that I am calling on Miss Mallory of Montague Street, and that I expect to continue doing so." She stopped walking. "I know what I'm saying," he said. "After the Ashworth business, I promised myself I would be certain before I spoke. I have been certain for several weeks." "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I am not uncertain about you specifically. I am uncertain about the largeness of it, my history. I know it isn't yours. I just need more time to be sure that I know it." "Then I will keep calling," he said, "until you are sure. Don't expect me to be grateful for that. I am not a project." "No," he said. "You have built a life from £40 a year and considerable intelligence, and I am not calling because you need anything from me. I am calling because I cannot seem to stop thinking about the library." "Which library?" she said. "All of them," he said very quietly. "Any room you are in." She breathed. The pearl brooch was cold at her throat. "Friday next," she said. "There is a lecture at the Royal Institution, Natural Philosophy. I'll be there." Behind them, at 20 paces, Margot appeared to be studying the middle distance with extraordinary concentration. They parted, and Harriet walked back toward Bloomsbury with her face turned into the cold, thinking about the woman in the painting, the letter in both hands, the light on her face, and thinking, both. It is both. December came in early and firm. He called on Tuesdays and Fridays, always in Mrs. Peel's ground-floor parlour with Mrs. Peel herself somewhere adjacent, a convention that satisfied the requirements of decorum without requiring anyone to discuss it. This had not been arranged so much as understood, the way certain things settle into pattern without being designed. Tuesdays he brought his correspondence and worked at the small table while Harriet translated at the other end, and they talked when there was something to say. By the 3rd week, she had begun to understand that this was the most comfortable she had been in a room with another person in years. She was careful not to say so. She told him about Corneille's scansion and why it resisted translation. He told her about the Merath drainage dispute, which had become, by some logic she didn't follow, a matter involving 3 neighbouring farmers and the rights to a mill built in 1703. When she mentioned Mrs. Elton's open Wednesday evenings, a widow of her acquaintance who kept a small musical gathering that served as a kind of unofficial salon, he said he had never attended a private concert, and she said, without thinking, "Come Wednesday then," and he had. He sat among 12 guests in Mrs. Elton's drawing room and listened to a young woman perform Scarlatti on a pianoforte that had seen 30 years of Wednesday evenings. His expression throughout was attentive and quiet, and she had glanced at him during the slow movement. Something more than that. Afterward, "Well, better than I expected. Not a compliment to the room, a compliment to the music." She had looked away before the expression around his eyes could do anything further. Margot called on a grey Tuesday morning and sat on Mrs. Peel's settee with her feet tucked up, and the air of a woman who has been patient long enough. "He is different," she said. "He laughs, not like before, easily." "He has always laughed." "Harriet," she looked at her steadily, "he hasn't mentioned Ashworth in 2 months. He asked me in October if he thought it was possible to want something again after you decided you didn't. I think it is, for him. I think you're the reason." She paused. "The brooch. You're wearing it." "I always wear it in London." "You didn't wear it every day at Merath. You wore it when things shifted. What does it mean when you wear it now?" Harriet looked at the small cluster of seed pearls, worn at one edge where her mother's collar must have rubbed it. "That I'm paying attention," she said, "to something that matters." "I'm afraid," Harriet said, "that what I feel is out of proportion to what I'm certain of." "It hasn't happened before," Margot said gently. "Not like this." "No," Harriet said, "not like this." He came on Friday the 10th, and he was not his usual composed self, not agitated, but with a tension in his stillness she hadn't seen since the garden path at Merath. "Something has happened," she said. "Lady Ashworth is in London." A pause. She wrote to my solicitor about a piece of jewelry she believes was not returned, a bracelet. My solicitor says she has it, but has misplaced it. It is not a significant matter. But you are telling me, because you will hear she is in town, and I would rather you hear it from me, with the context. And are you? I feel nothing. The residue of embarrassment, the kind that is more about the audience than the person. He stopped. What she did and what I did. It was 2 years ago. I am not. She had not seen him struggle for language before. He was very good at language. She moved her chair closer to his, not dramatically, just close enough that he did not have to raise his voice to be quiet. Piers. He looked at her. I believe you, she said. He breathed. I'm not asking for reassurance. I know, I'm giving it anyway. A silence, then very quietly. I am not certain I know how to do this. Do what? Be careful about someone again. She said, I know. Then she did something she had not planned. Reached out and put her hand over his briefly, barely a moment, a pressure, and then gone. He looked at where her hand had been. She drew back to her own side of the table. Tell me what your solicitor actually said, because the legal summary was a compression. The expression on his face was the one from the painting, unreadable, luminous, both. It was a significant compression, he said. He told her. She listened. When he paused, she said, Your solicitor is correct. This will resolve itself. Yes. Then let it. Yes, he said, differently. She stood in Mrs. Peel's hallway after he left, hand on the door, thinking, I am certain enough, I have been certain enough for several weeks. I am simply afraid. Then, caution and cowardice look very similar from the inside. She had said that to him on a terrace in October. She went upstairs and sat at her desk, and after a while began to translate, and the passage happened to be Rodrigue, as-tu du cœur. Rodrigue, have you courage? And she read it twice, and made a sound that was not quite a laugh. The kiss happened on the 17th of December, on the stairs of Mrs. Peel's house. The narrow staircase between the ground-floor parlour and the upper rooms, which Piers was not supposed to reach, and which he had reached because they had both forgotten, for one absorbed hour, that the rule existed. It had been a Tuesday. He had come with his correspondence, they had worked in parallel, and then she had read aloud a passage of the Corneille she was struggling with, a speech where the scansion would not survive translation without losing either rhythm or sense. Read it again, he said. She had. What if it's not a speech? What if it's a question? She read it as a question and the whole passage unlocked. How did you... The French. He's not stating, he's asking. You actually read Corneille, she said. I was not always... Relentlessly practical, she said. He smiled, a real one, rare enough to be worth more. When the hour was done, she walked him toward the door, and they had reached the foot of the upper staircase, the boundary he was not meant to cross, when she stopped on the second stair, and he stopped below her, and they were at the same height, and she had not noticed until now that when they stood level, his eyes were precisely the colour she would have called, if asked, clear. Harriet, he said, her name, the specific weight of it. I'm certain, she said, I am certain. He raised one hand to her face, cupped along her cheek with the care of something irreversible, and she leaned into it slightly, and then he kissed her. Not tentative, not desperate. The kiss of two careful people who had taken a long time to arrive at a moment and did not intend to waste it. When they separated, they were both very still. Right, he said. Yes, she said. I should. The solicitor at 2. Go, she said. Tuesday, he said. Go, she said again, but was not yet willing to take her eyes from his face. She heard the front door, the carriage, the street resume. She put her hand against the wall of the staircase. The pearl brooch was warm. He proposed on Christmas Eve afternoon in Mrs. Peel's parlour, the city outside carrying the strange quiet of a day that had decided something. I want to marry you. A declaration, then, is that something you want? Harriet set down the letter she was holding. You know I have nothing. How you have £40 a year and a room full of books and a publisher who's about to discover what you're worth. I have an estate that is solvent again and 17 bedrooms and a library I have apparently been saving for you. She thought about the library, the terrace, the churchyard, the staircase. This is not the same thing, I know it isn't, and I am not afraid. Yes, she said. He crossed the room, took her hand and put something in it. A ring, Small plain gold with a single pearl set in the center. My mother's, I've had it since 1809. The pearl was exactly the color of the seed pearls in her brooch. She would have liked you, he said. You said that before in the churchyard. I meant it then. I mean it more now. She slid the ring on. It fit. Some things are simply ready. She looked up. He was watching her with the expression she had first seen in the walled garden and had been trying to name ever since. She knew it now. It was certainty. She reached up and took his face in her hands. The same gesture returned, and kissed him again, and this time neither of them was going anywhere. They were married in February at St. George's, Hanover Square, on a Thursday morning that settled on a grey brightness, cold and clean and honest. The banns had been read in the preceding weeks, which gave the neighbourhood something to discuss, and gave Harriet 3 weeks of very precise attention, from acquaintances she had not known were so warmly disposed toward her. She received this attention with the calm of a woman who had translated Racine through worse and returned every call. Margot was there, radiant with the satisfaction of precise meddling. Colonel Marsh attended and fell asleep briefly during the third reading and woke in time for the vows, which everyone agreed was the Colonel at his best. Mrs. Peel attended as Harriet's guest, which surprised several people, and which Harriet had arranged specifically because Mrs. Peel had made propriety possible and deserved to see what it had produced. Harriet wore the blue dress, because saving her good things for good occasions was a habit she intended to revise, and the pearl brooch at her throat. The ring on her finger was gold with a single pearl. Piers stood at the altar with the expression of a man who had decided something and arrived at it. When it was done, Margot cried, said she was not crying, and surprised no one. They spent the first 2 weeks at Merath. The Abbey in February was not the Abbey of October. It was quieter, stripped of the social machinery of a house party, reduced to its own life. Fires in the rooms they used, the grounds bare and cold. The library exactly as she remembered it, perhaps more itself without anyone else in it. He had cleared a shelf on the east wall before they arrived. She found the gap with a small card, for the cornet, and whatever comes after. She stood at the shelf for a long time. Then she went to find him in the estate office. The east wall, she said. I thought it was the right bay. Third from the window. It was where the Wollstonecraft was. Yes, he said. She left him to the land agent. She went to the library and put the cornet first. They were not always easy with each other. Marriage, they discovered, revealed things that house parties and sitting rooms had not. He was very particular about order. She was not particular about it at all. He wrote correspondence before breakfast. She read before breakfast. They arrived by the third week at an arrangement. His letters on the left, her book on the right, toast in the middle. That neither had formally proposed, but both independently decided was satisfactory. When he was wrong about something, he became very quiet and very precise for several hours, then came and found her, and stated the correct version of events without inflection. She waited him out. When she went quiet mid-conversation because a thought had taken her elsewhere, he would wait 3 minutes and then say her name, just that, and she would surface. Racine, go on. He found this, as far as she could tell, somewhere between exasperating and extremely endearing. And she found his version of it, the silence, the recovery, the precision, less irritating than she had expected, because it was not dishonesty. It was simply the way he processed. They were both learning the grammar of each other. Margot visited in April and found them in the library arguing about Pope's translation of Homer. I'm very pleased with myself, she said, to no one. We know, they said in near unison without looking up. Margot sat down with her own book and stayed for a week. On the last evening she said to Harriet, while Piers was out with the land agent, he laughs more. Yes, Harriet said. Not performed laughing, the other kind. I know. Good, said Margot, and picked up her book again and said nothing further because she was very good at knowing when she had said enough. Their first child was born in January of 1818, in the large bedroom in the east wing of Merath Abbey, after a labour that was long and difficult, and ended with a daughter who announced herself with considerable feeling at 4:30 in the morning. They named her Catherine for his mother. Piers held her with the specific quality of a person being very careful about something important, and the expression on his face was one Harriet had not seen on him before. Plain, unguarded wonder. Hello, he said to the baby very quietly. Catherine blinked at him and said nothing, which was exactly right. Harriet watched from the bed. exhausted past the point of performance, and felt something large and quiet settle in her chest. Not completion, that was the wrong word, too final. Expansion, rather. The sense of life becoming larger than she had known it could. She had never expected to have this. At 26, in a hired post-chaise on a Shropshire road, she had not believed it was available to her. She had believed in the work and the £40 in the room with the 4 shelves. But this was hers too, all of it. She touched the pearl brooch on the table beside the bed. She had not worn it tonight. She would wear it tomorrow when she was herself again, when the day had organized itself into its new shape. She would put it on, and it would mean, I am here. I am exactly who I am. For now she looked at her husband and her daughter, and let the feeling be as large as it was. 2 years later there was a boy, James, who had Piers's dark hair and Harriet's grey eyes, and her complete indifference to anyone's schedule but his own. He was loud where Catherine was quiet, and decisive where she deliberated, and he found the library at 14 months, and pulled every book from the lowest shelf, with the focused satisfaction of a person doing something important. Piers restacked them in silence. He did this 4 times. "You could move the books," Harriet said. "I could," he said. He moved the books up 2 shelves and put James's blocks on the lower one. And from that point James carried the blocks around the library with a proprietary air he had learned, unmistakably, from his father. Harriet watched this and thought, this house is full now. It was not a complaint. It was an observation she made the way she made observations about good translations, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found the right word after a long search. The third came in 1822, a second daughter, Eleanor, born in May, when the walled kitchen garden was in its best estate. Harriet had spent the last weeks of the pregnancy walking there every morning, the way she had walked every morning since before she could afford to walk anywhere better. The habit had simply moved, from necessity to pleasure, from Herefordshire to Bloomsbury to Shropshire, and the walk itself remained the same, the cold, the clarity, the private conversation with the morning. Piers walked with her sometimes, not always. He had learned over 6 years of marriage which mornings were hers and which were theirs, and he did not confuse them. This was one of the better things about him, and there were many better things about him, and she had stopped being surprised by them and simply collected them instead, the way she collected books, one by one, permanent, hers. Eleanor was given her grandmother's ring to hold briefly, as the family now did, the pearl in the gold setting going from Harriet's finger into each new baby's hand for one careful moment before returning. It had begun with Catherine and had become fixed without being decided, the way the best traditions did. "She'll want it one day," Margot said, watching. "Eleanor, she has the look of someone who will want an excellent ring." "She's 3 hours old," Harriet said. "I know people early," Margot said serenely. "Margot," said Piers beside the bed with his daughter, and the expression of plain wonder that all 3 had produced in him identically. "Not today." "Fine," Margot said, and sat down and was quiet for approximately 4 minutes. In the years that followed, the library acquired 2 additional shelves. This was not planned. It was simply the consequence of 2 readers sharing a house, each with existing collections and ongoing additions. Piers's books occupied the north wall, as they always had. Harriet's grew along the east wall from the bay where the Woolstonecraft had been, spreading south with each new translation project and each enthusiastic acquisition from the lending libraries and booksellers she frequented in London during their winter months. By 1823, the collection had outgrown the east wall and was beginning a tentative colonization of the window alcoves, which Piers observed with the expression of a man being very reasonable about something that was testing the outer limits of his reasonableness. "The alcoves," he said one morning, looking at a stack of texts she had left in the nearer one. The alcoves were empty. "The alcoves are part of the architecture. The alcoves are spaces that can hold books." He looked at her. She looked at him. "Third alcove only," he said, "and they must be shelved, not stacked. Third alcove and the window seat. The window seat is for sitting." "The window seat has held books since 1816, she said. "I have not sat in it without books since the week I arrived. You know this. You sat in the other one." He was quiet. "The window seat," he said, "and the third alcove." "Agreed," she said. He went to his desk. She went to the window seat. The books stayed where they were. This was, as far as either of them was concerned, exactly how decisions should be made. The Mule remark came back in the autumn of 1823. Colonel Marsh, at a dinner at Merith, the neighbours, a few friends, the dining room at full length, said to the table at large, "I recall, Merith, you were quoted once as saying something rather extraordinary about mules." Around the table, several people found their wine glasses interesting. Piers, at the head of the table, looked at Harriet at the other end. She said clearly and without inflection, "He said he would sooner marry a mule than a woman who led with her opinions and had nothing else to offer." Another silence longer. "And yet," said Margot from the middle of the table, with the timing of someone who has waited 7 years for this precise moment, "here we are." Laughter, general, warm, the kind that releases something. "I was wrong," Piers said. "You were," she said. "About nearly everything." "Not everything. The Corneille, the Pope translation." "I was right about Pope." "You were entirely wrong about Pope." "Harriet!" "Pope is a separate conversation," she said, "that we have been having for 6 years." Colonel Marsh was delighted. The table was delighted. Margot refilled her wine with the satisfaction of a woman at the height of her powers. Piers looked at his wife from the length of the dining-room table of Merith Abbey. She looked back at him. The candlelight caught the pearl brooch at her throat. She wore it at dinner, had worn it at dinner for years. It was hers, and it was home. "I was wrong," he said again, just to her, beneath the table's renewed conversation. "I know," she said. "So was I about some things." He raised his glass. She raised hers. Around them, Merith Abbey, 3 centuries of stone. The dining room at full length, Margot laughing at something the Colonel said, the sound of children asleep in the rooms above, a fire that burned well, a marriage that had built itself one honest conversation at a time. The pearl brooch caught the light. She touched it once, briefly, with 2 fingers. "This," it said. Yes, she thought, exactly this.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment. Thanks for watching.